So I've just been sitting here listening, thinking about resilience. This isn't actually part of the sermon, this is just me. And thinking about resilience and how over the last year and a half plus, we keep shifting and adapting who we are and how we are as a congregation, as a people of faith. And it occurred to me, I've always thought of resilience as like this bouncing back, and we're back. And realizing that the resilience is continually moving back and forth. And we're somewhere in between the full apex of bouncing all the way back, but certainly not at the bottom. I'm grateful, profoundly grateful this morning for all of you who are joining us online today, for all of you who are able to be in the sanctuary today, for that steadfastness that creates resilience in one another. It's one thing to be resilient on my own, like I can do that, but it's so much easier when there's resilience around me that I can remember even in my hardest moments, even in the lowest points for me, I can bounce back because you all helped me get there. So thank you for that. For those of you who joined us last week, and you'll know that our Soul Matters theme, our worship themes for this month is called Holding History. And we're inviting you particularly in contemplation of the challenge of holding difficult histories, right? And for example, last week, Heather Petit, our ministerial intern, Heather Petit, offered this wonderful sermon on the complexity of a Unitarian minister named Theodore Parker. Hopefully many of you know who that is, and he's sort of a UU hero of ours, Theodore Parker, but a very complex story. And if you missed that sermon, it's on our YouTube channel, and it's well worth listening to. So you can check that out. But really, Heather did a wonderful job at kind of teasing out some of that complexity. So today, I want us to engage in another difficult history. Now, in our reading today, you heard Stephen read excerpts from Christopher Columbus's journal when he and his famous voyage reached what is now called San Salvador. But the story I want to share with you today is not that story. It's another version of that story, and it's out of this book called Encounter. I know many of you online maybe can't see that cover, but it's a children's book. Although when I read it, I'm like, wow, pretty tough history for children to hear. But it's by an author by Jane Yolen. And she imagined what that encounter of Columbus's ships might have been from the eyes of one of the Taino people, particularly from the eyes of a Taino child. And by the way, I want to thank Diana Saunders, who's a member of our worship team. She's the one who brought this book to my attention, and it's a true gift. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to offer you today, I actually decided I'm just going to tell you read the whole story to you, because I think it's really rich and wonderful in her language, in how she did, and how she tells this story. But as I do, I want you to hold Christopher Columbus's narrative that you've heard and all that you know of that story. Most of us probably grew up knowing the Christopher Columbus side of the story, right? And then I want you to pay attention to the way this story that Janet Yolen imagines both agrees with and contradicts Columbus's version of events. But in that, I want you to notice your response. Do you dismiss the Jane Yolen story because it was made up, right? Do you privilege Columbus's journal because it was his personal account, what we might call a primary source document? Do you prefer Columbus's version of the story because that's the one you were taught? Or do you resonate with the Jane Yolen story because it imaginatively represents the unrecorded voice of a people long gone? So this is called Encounter by Jane Yolen. The moon was well overhead, and our great fire had burned low. A loud clap of thunder woke me from my dream. All dreams are not true dreams, my mother says. But in my dream that night, 3 great winged birds with voices like thunder rode wild waves into our bay. They were not like any birds I'd ever seen, for sharp white teeth filled their mouths. I left my hammock and walked to the beach. There were my dream birds again, only now they were real. 3 great sailed canoes floating in the bay. I stared at them all through the night. When the sun rose, each great canoe gave birth to many little ones that swam awkwardly to our shore. I ran and found our chief still sleeping in his hammock. Do not welcome them, I begged him. My dream is a warning. But it is our custom to welcome strangers, to give them the tobacco leaf, to feast them with the pepper pot, and to trade gifts. You are but a child, our chief said to me. All children have bad dreams. The baby canoes spat out many strange creatures, men, but not men. We did not know them as human beings, for they hid their bodies in colors like parrots. Their feet were hidden also. And many of them had hair growing like bushes on their chins. 3 of them knelt before their chief and pushed sticks into the sand. Then I was even more afraid. Our young men left the shelter of the trees. I, who was not yet a man, followed, crying, "Do not welcome them. Do not call them friends." No one listened to me, for I was just a child. Our chief said, "We must see if they are true men." So I took one by the hand and I pinched it. The hand felt like flesh and blood, but the skin was moon to my son. And the stranger made a funny noise with his mouth, not like talking, but like the barking of a yellow dog. Our chief said to us, "See how pale they are? No one can be that color who comes from the earth. Surely they must come from the sky." Then he leapt before them and put his hands up, pointing to the sky to show he had understood how far they had flown. "Perhaps they have tails," said my elder brother. "Perhaps they have no feet." Our young men smiled, but behind their hands, so the guests would not feel bad. Then they turned around to show that they had no tails. Our chief gave the strangers balls of cotton thread to bind them to us in friendship. He gave them spears that they might fish and not starve. He gave them gum rubber balls for sport. He gave them parrots, too, which made our young men laugh behind their hands all over again, knowing it was our chief's little joke that the strangers looked like parrots. But the strangers behaved almost like human beings, for they laughed too, and gave in return tiny smooth balls the color of sand and sea and sun strung upon a thread. And they gave hollow shells with tongues that sang chunga chunga. And they gave woven things that fit upon a man's head and could cover a boy's ears. And for a while I forgot my dream. For a while I was not afraid. So we built a great feasting fire and readied the pepper pot and yams and cassava bread and fresh fish. For though the strangers were not quite human beings, we would still treat them as such. Our chief rolled tobacco leaves and showed them how to smoke, but they coughed and snorted and clearly did not know about these simple things. Then I leaned forward and stared into their chief's eyes. They were blue and gray, like the shifting sea. And suddenly I remembered my dream and stared at each of the strangers in turn. Even those with dark human eyes looked away like dogs before they are driven from the fire. So I drew back from the feast, which is not what one should do. And I watched how the sky strangers touched our golden nose rings and our golden armbands, but not the flesh of our faces or arms. I watched their chief smile. It was a serpent's smile of lips and teeth. I jumped up crying, "Do not welcome them." But the welcome had already been given. I ran back under the trees, back to the place where my zemi stood. I fed it little pieces of cassava and fish and yam from the feast, and then I prayed. Let the pale strangers from the sky go away from us. My zemi stared back at me with unblinking wood eyes. I gave it the smooth balls a stranger had dropped in my hand. Take these eyes and see into the hearts of the strangers from the sky. If it must be, let something happen to me to show our people what they should know. My zemi was silent. It spoke only in dreams. Indeed, it had spoken to me already. When I returned to the feast, one of the strangers let me touch his sharp silver stick, and to show I was not afraid, I grasped it firmly as one would a spear. It bit my palm so hard that the blood cried out. But still, no one understood. No one heard. They did not hear because they did not want to listen. They desired all that the strangers had brought, the sharp silver spear, round pools to hold in the hand that gave man back his face, darts that sprang from sticks with a sound like thunder that could kill a parrot many paces away. But we were given none of these, only singing shells and tiny balls on strings. We were patted on the head as a child pats a yellow dog. We were smiled at with many white teeth, a serpent's smile. And the next day, the strangers returned to their great canoes, and they took 5 of our young men and many parrots with them. And they took me. I knew then that this was a sign from my zemis, a sign for my people. So I was brave, and I did not cry out. But I was afraid. And that night, while my people slept on the shore, the great sailed canoes left our big bay, going farther and farther than even our strongest men could go. Soon the beach and trees and everything I knew slipped away until my world was only a thin, dark line stretched between sky and sea. What else was there to do? In the early morning, another land lay close enough to see. So silently, I let myself over the side of the great canoe. I fell down and down and down into the cold water, and then I swam to that strange shore. And for many days I walked, following the sun, and many nights I swam, and many times the sky was full with moon and stars, and all along the way I told people of how I had sailed in the great canoes. I told of the pale strangers from the sky. I said our blood would cry out in the sand. I spoke of my dream of the white teeth, but even those who saw the great canoes did not listen, for I was a child. So it was that we lost our lands to the strangers from the sky. We gave our souls to their gods. We took their speech into our mouths, forgetting our own. Our sons and daughters became their sons and daughters, no longer true humans, no longer ours. And that is why I, an old man now, dream no more dreams. That is why I sit here wrapped in a stranger's cloak, counting the stranger's bells on a string and telling my story. May it be a warning to all the children and all the people in every land. The end. It's estimated that in 1492 there were about 300,000 Taino living on the island they called Guanahami, because the iguanas on the island. Within about 50 years of Columbus's so-called discovery, there were only about 500 remaining. Today there are none, having all been killed or assimilated through European colonialism. Now, I invited you this morning to pay attention to how this story felt for you. For some, it may just be an interesting take on the familiar, or maybe what you feel is anger. Some may feel sadness. Some may have a sense of honor or gratitude. Some even a sense of shame. Some of us indifference. And some of you, perhaps many of you, may be a bit like myself, feeling ambivalence, trying to hold this whole broad range of feelings, trying to carefully tease out a sense of, who am I in all of this? It's the great question, isn't it? Who am I in all of this? And truly, friends, this is where I invite us to stay for a while, in the ambiguous spaces around what we think we know about history. This is the gift of our ambiguous and multifaceted histories, the gift of finding all our complexities, all our contradictions, all our humanness in these stories, in all of the stories of the past. Because it does not serve us to hold only one story. Much of my life, I've just believed there was this one story. But there are more than one. There are 1,000,001. It does not serve us to believe in only one story. It does not serve our compassion to hold so tightly to that one story that we're supposed to believe. It does not serve our understandings of ourselves, of who we are in this cosmos, if we carve our ancestors as either heroes or villains, sainted or damned. In our Mill Creek DNA, in our values, beliefs, and mission, we state this. We say we believe in the power of story to understand ourselves and the cosmos in the continual process of creation. And we design intentional spaces for all of us to tell our stories with the expectation that those stories change us. That's the power of our stories. That's the power of our histories. In listening to one another, listening to the stories, we have an expectation that those stories will change us. So my invitation to you today, to all of us today, is to build those spaces in your heart, those spaces where you might hold contradiction and paradox. Spaces where each story you learn is another little piece of the mosaic that is our history, that is our humanity. In so doing, may we more deeply connect with who we are at our core. Because that deep authenticity, that is what will transform this world from brokenness to wholeness, transform us from oppression to power, from unjust to just, from separateness to relationship, from isolation to beloved community. Amen, my friends. And I love you. And may we live in blessing.